The other month we went on a paddle in Porthmadog in North Wales. This was a great place to paddle, and I thought I'd take the opportunity to go over some things to keep in mind when paddling on estuaries, which can often have tricky conditions to keep in mind, such as strong winds and tides. Now, an estuary is basically a tidal river, so where the river mouth meets the sea. The first things I checked before going out onto the estuary was the tide height times and direction of the wind. As we paddled out of the harbour, I noticed that the wind was a lot less strong on the right hand side of the harbour, so this is why we headed to the right hand side to take a bit of shelter from the wind. But I checked the tide times to get an idea of when we should set off. With this being an estuary, we ideally needed the tide to be in and high so that we actually had some water to paddle on. We also did not want to get caught at any point when the tide was going out quickly, from high to low, as this could have swept us out to sea. When we got to the end of the harbour, the wind started to pick up again, as there was no headland from stopping the wind, so it got a lot windier going round the corner into the next bay. As you can see here, the waves started to pick up slightly, start to get a bit choppier, but once we got around the first headland, we stopped off in this nice little bay for a rest out of the wind. For a quick general tip, tidal flow is usually the slowest 1 hour either side of high or low tide. This is called the slack tide. Therefore, we settled on setting off from the harbour around an hour before peak high tide. This meant that the tide was high enough for us to paddle on, and there was plenty of time to head out around the bay, do a bit of exploring, and paddle back to the harbour before the tide started to go out again at its quickest rate. Tides can be tricky to understand and can vary greatly in different locations. Therefore, you can always check websites like Surfline to find out local tide times. Went back out around the next headland, and we spotted some nice little beaches which you can only really get to when the tide is around this height from paddling around into them. And yeah, we went for a quick dip, and even though this was summer, it was still pretty chilly in the sea. After messing about at the beaches for a bit, we started to head back down the estuary. Wind speed can get fairly strong on coastlines, so always make sure you check the speed and direction of the wind. Again, this can be checked on websites like Surfline. For this paddle, the wind was moderately strong, but it was blowing onshore, which means it was always going to be easier paddling back to our starting point than out from it, as the wind was blowing from the sea back into the land. Onshore is often safer when paddling it around coast, as strong offshore winds can push you further into the sea and make it more difficult when trying to paddle back to your starting point. This time the wind was behind us, so you really didn't even need to paddle at all. You could literally just float back to where we started. Once we got back to the apartment, I rinsed off the boards with some fresh water. This is a good tip because if you do go out on the sea, you'll want to wash the salt off your board just to keep it nice and clean. Overall, really nice place to paddle, and I would highly recommend anyone going here. Really good for all abilities, just make sure you check that wind. It can get pretty strong, but if it's blowing back on shore, then as far as you go out, you're going to get blown back pretty easily. So if you did enjoy the video, please be sure to leave a like and drop a comment, and don't forget to subscribe. And remember, keep paddling.
That's a paddling.